Being an organizer of the conference, one of the organizers, it's always nice that you can call on your friends to step in for keynote talks. And it is my great privilege to invite Pelonomi Moiloa to the stage to give our second keynote talk. And I'll just tell you a little bit about why Pelonomi will be on stage. As an institute, we think about the future of Africa. And we're not just a mathematics institute, but the things we do touch technology, they touch industry, and they touch Africa. And my background is in artificial intelligence. And Pelonomi works at the intersection of AI, natural language processing, and Pan-Africanism. I saw her slides, and she's being extremely modest, so I'll just mention two things about her. Three things, actually. I circulated a video amongst the AIM staff last year where she was with the co-founder Jade on SABC primetime 8 o'clock TV news. She was also one of South Africa's top 200 most influential people a couple of years ago. And then if you ever read Time magazine, I don't know if any of you know that magazine. If you read Time magazine published a list of the most influential people in AI today, and Pelonomi was on the front page of Time a couple of months ago. So this is a great honor for us to have her on stage. Pelonomi, on behalf of AIMS, I just want to say we are so, so proud of you and your team for what you're building in Africa. We are grateful that you're here. We are tremendously proud of you. What you and your team are achieving is an example of where African tech should be going. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, everybody. It's quite beautiful to be here, witnessing the growth and success of something that was born 20 years ago. You will now compare that to something that is very much a teeny tiny little baby that has just barely learned to walk. We weren't started a long time ago, and I'll be speaking a bit about that today. But it seems there might be some kind of trend. I too am the daughter or child of political activists. And in fact, my mum was held in detention in solitary confinement, and part of her experience brought the end of the detention with no trial. So there's a bit of a connection there. But today I will be talking to you a bit more about the company that myself, as well as my 5 co-founders, have built over the past 2 years or so. I am the small fry. My co-founders really are the incredible beings that have made this thing come together. But just before I start, I would like to get a little bit more of a sense of who is in the room. I know that earlier it was spoken that there are a bunch of people, but I just want to make sure I'm pitching this at the right level. So if you could just raise your hand if you're an AIM student. Okay, cool. If you're a tertiary student who's not at AIMS, I don't know if they were invited, maybe they were excluded. No, I saw a hand. Okay, cool. If you are a professional in technology, to me that includes technical professional teaching students. That counts too. Okay, cool. I saw the tech team at the back raise their arms. Fantastic. And professional not in tech necessarily. Maybe you're doing something else. Okay, cool. Good to know. Okay, so last year I did one of the most terrifying things of my life. I seem to do a lot of terrifying things lately. And that was to give a TED Talk. And while I got off the stage, trying to calm my nerves, shaking, I made a promise myself to never do a public talk ever again. And then, like 2 months later, I got an email from Ulrich being like, please come to Cape Town. And I think I originally said no, and I was like, no, I can't, because I have so much respect for Ulrich, for what he's built here, and also for the rest of the Deep Learning and Daba team, many of whom are my co-founders. But last year when I was doing that TED Talk, I was in San Francisco. And San Francisco is a very strange place. Apparently it decayed a bit over the past couple of years. Oh, this video is not loading, that's fine. It was a video of myself and my co-founder inside a Waymo. It was an autonomous vehicle that doesn't have a driver, but is basically an Uber and drives you around like an Uber without a driver. And that was probably the most exciting thing of being in San Francisco. I seem to be afflicted with something that makes me believe that when I go to first world countries, everybody there should be smart. And every time I go, I'm really disappointed. Because I'm of the belief that you have the opportunity, you know, you mentioned earlier about the child in Lesotho who probably won't have the opportunities to go to school and study and have the resources to become an incredible contributor to the world in technological ways. And what I found in Silicon Valley is that it's very much a bubble there, and it's a reinforcement bubble of people who are focused on very particular things. And I was reminded once again of this thing that people say the grass is always greener on the other side. I think it might have been somebody called Nyaleng Murosi, who's part of the technology AI machine learning field. Maybe you're not so aware of her because you're in the mathematics side. She's more on the AI side, but I think it was her who said it. And she said, the grass is always greener on the side because it's covered in manure. She didn't use the word manure. She used something that was a little less presentation friendly. But I think it's an important thing to note, that just because things come from outside doesn't mean that they're more valuable. And in fact, what is more valuable is when you water the grass here at home. But I was at a beehive building workshop on Saturday in Khayelitsha. And the beehive that I was learning to build was actually one made from grass. It was made from thatch grass. And in that moment, I thought to myself, who cares about green grass? Because the grass in Africa is brown and it is long. And so the story that I'll be telling you a little bit about today is how Lelapa is decided not to grow green grass. You know, we have other things that we're focusing on. We're focusing on the African continent and what it needs. And we're not going to copy what happens overseas and decide that what overseas does is important and valid for humanity to move forward. So who is Lelapa AI? What is Lelapa AI? We are an African-driven, humanity-centered AI company transforming society for the better. And you'll have to forgive me, I took this slide from like our investor deck. So it has some big words to help convince them. But it is a combination of some world-leading founders. Jade over there built Masakhane because she wanted to learn Southern African languages and found that there was no research that could enable her to do that. So she just decided that the whole of Africa then should have a research organization where we can start building this technology so that there is a presence of this technology on the internet for African languages. Her alongside Vukosi have now gotten that grown to an organization called Masakhane. And Masakhane is a grassroots research movement with over 1,000 researchers contributing from all over the African continent to putting African machine learning for African languages on the map. Some of my other co-founders were, I don't know when it was, maybe 2015 or 2016 with Ulrich, putting their brains together to bring about the Deep Learning Indaba, which is the biggest machine learning summer school in the world and is for Africans by Africans. And yeah, those world-leading founders came together with this top African AI talent network, of which AIMS is a part. When you look at the reason why Africa is behind in technology, it often says that human resources are one of the issues, that there's a skills shortage. I don't believe that that's the case. We have many talented people on the African continent, and we have a tap into that. And then, I'm an eternal optimist, so you'll have to forgive me when I put a spin on things that otherwise don't seem so good. But Africa is a place with an abundance of problems. And I think it is absolute privilege to be in a place that not only has ways for you to flex your intelligent brain around solving problems, but also in a way that genuinely can have huge amounts of impact. It means that Africa has so many low-hanging fruit that you can contribute to improving the world just by doing a small little bit in your corner of where you are. And that is a privilege that other people in the world don't have. But combining those three things together, we then have these two kind of outputs. The first of which is creating a leading research lab for AI-based products and services, but also with the opportunity to commercialize R&D. And this is a balance that we're having to balance continuously in our practice as technology creators. And the driven outputs or the ideas of what that will then manifest in is firstly to share how to build resource-efficient innovation to the rest of the world. It's not possible for everybody to consume in the way that the first world does. And that is the reason why we do have this disparity in consumption. If you came from the Cape Town airport, you saw some of that disparity of the wall separating the informal settlements from the people who can afford to fly in to the airport. So we're looking at, teaching the world of how not to use so much to create value. And then at the same time, using that technology to genuinely improve impact on the ground. And these two approaches are described by animals, I guess, quite often in the startup world. The innovation for the world, is described by this unicorn phenomenon of a startup doing really well, getting a lot of investment, a lot of attention, and a lot of attraction. And that impact is often only seen very far in the future once that technology has had a chance to grow and demonstrate what its value is. But more immediately, I was reading a post on LinkedIn the other day that described that African startups often have to be more of a camel. They're like this really sturdy animal who can survive off of not so much, but goes the long distance and often travels in groups. And us at Lelapa are having to balance those two sides of the camel and the unicorn. And we've combined ourselves and often describes ourselves as this camel corn. Because at the same time that we want to think of the future very far ahead and plan for that, we also are in dire need for change to happen now on the African continent. Cool. So what that means is Lelapa AI is a socially grounded, Africa-centric AI research and product lab. And we build the technology for Africans to communicate digitally in our own languages. And as I mentioned earlier, we are baby, just learning to walk. We are, in fact, pre-ChatGPT. Unfortunately, we closed our seed funding round 2 months before ChatGPT came out. Maybe if we had extended a lot longer than that, then we would have a lot more money, and we wouldn't be looking at raising towards the end of this year. But essentially, we are 3 months in after our first hire, 13 months in, sorry. And we're 27 people from 7 African countries. We are Pan-Africanist in the way that we approach our technology building. We believe that the cultural diversity that is present on the African continent is something that will bolster our problem-solving capability. A lot of that problem-solving capability is inherent in the language and how we view and see the world, and therefore how it influences how we think. And we think and believe that in order to harness all of that talent, we need to have people from different areas representing their knowledge, but also representing the communities that they're building for. Where am I supposed to be pointing this at? Where is the receiver? It's a mystery, okay. And yeah, our unique advantage is that we are the network. much like many Africans, our family is a big one. I don't know whose funeral we'll go to and find that we have cousins and sisters and brothers that we didn't know existed, but our family reaches way across the African continent and the world, and we do see ourselves as a small part of a really big, larger ecosystem. We want all of us to succeed, and we know that we cannot succeed alone. So we have friends everywhere contributing to the work that we do, and we are contributing to the work that they do. I mean, most of those are friends. Some of those are a little bit questionable. But yeah, we're taking all the support that we can get because doing this is hard. And in this first 13 months, we have 15 permanent staff over 7 different countries on the African continent. We've built 3 different products. We have 18 publication affiliations, 15 language models that we've built and are ready in production. We have 5 features that we service in terms of language. So this means that the capability that a human is able to engage in from a language perspective, we're able to support. So that includes speech to text, text to speech, conversational capability, translation, as well as analysis capability, so being able to go through text and derive important insights. And we have 4 fully supported languages. Unlike other companies, we don't just claim to support all the languages that we use to train and bolster our models. So we're ready with 4, but we do touch 30 across the African continent. We just haven't benchmarked to make sure that we serve them correctly. And our 3 main features are the following. So we have this converse capability, which is not generative. So that means it's not a ChatGPT. It's a generation before the generative technology. And it's really important for us to work in this space because a lot of customer service requires conversational capability. And the models that we use in the converse space are few shot. So this means that you need very little data in order to get that functionality. And our models in the converse space are 120 times smaller than, for example, a GPT LLM. And in terms of performance, us comparing against benchmarks, these types of models commercially available to people who then can embed these products and services into their applications don't really exist. So we're building them. From a transcription perspective, this is enabling conversion of audio into text. We use about 150 hours to fine-tune our models on a particular language. The general number of languages that you would use is around 100,000 hours. So the incredible research team is able to take models and with some fancy mathematics. Actually, I don't know if it's fair to describe it as mathematics if it's just statistics, but some fancy statistics is able to find optimized ways of getting the best out of that data, making sure that data is very high quality. We're just able to do so much more with so much less. And in that case, we then have a model that is able to perform better, but with it's 5 times smaller than the typical commercially available model, which is Whisper. And with that model, we're able to get a 14% decrease in what is called the word error rate. So when you're comparing the words that come out of an audio for our model and models commercially available, we're 14%. Get it wrong, 14% less than those ones do. And from an analysis capability, this is kind of a bunch of models that help you understand text. This includes sentiment, so understanding whether text is happy or sad, or if the person who wrote the tweet was really angry or not, which is a bit of a complicated thing to do because people like to be, what's the word? They like to use satire or to be ironic. And that's really difficult for computers to understand because computers don't actually understand language. They're just trying to understand what is the statistical probability of something being true. But with the analysis capability, the data that we use is around 9,000 items. And this is way smaller than is typically used, for example, a ChatGPT that people often use, those kinds of models for these kinds of tasks. And that means that we're 12 times smaller than those models. And typically, commercially, in terms of having that model available to embed into a service that can serve a community, they don't really exist. There you go. So just a little bit more detail on those transcription models, where we are, in fact, able to compare them to industry competitors. The leading languages that we're dealing with at the moment are isiZulu, Sesotho, South African English, and Afrikaans. That is in the Southern African context, because most of the founders are from South Africa, so that's where we want to start it, because we knew that context a lot better. And as compared to Azure, Google, and AWS, we're able to perform way better than they are, and just keeping in mind with the slide before, with smaller models and with less data. And just a little bit more detail about that language coverage. So for example, here you can see with the transcription capability, part of our trick is making sure that we are zoning in on a particular domain. This allows us to use less data, allows us to use smaller models, but it also means that we're creating products from applied research. We're not just doing things for fun to see whether we can do it. We're doing it because we know that that technology will have value in a particular space, and therefore have real value on the ground for people who then need access to that technology. Quite interesting here is that we're having to also do South African English models. I mean, English models should be the ones that are most diversely available, but because so many people on the African continent are forced to speak English because they're unable to engage with technological services in their own languages, we have a range of accents that we're having to deal with in order for them to be able to use that technology. So that is included in our transcription domain. And in the analysis domain, a lot of our stuff is actually multilingual. But this is the point where we say, if you want to use it and you genuinely want to serve a group of people, we trust our models for those 4 languages and not for the 30 languages that we actually have capability for. And yeah, it's not just us who have models available, so we have partnerships with startups in Ghana and Ethiopia, and we're looking to expand that so that we're able to supply services for more languages, but not just purely by developing that technology ourselves, but leveraging our community and the startup ecosystem in order to provide those services. And yeah, we're looking to expand to West Africa and East Africa soon in terms of our capability as well. I don't know if this video will work as, let's see. How do I press play? Maybe this one. Oh, no. That was definitely the wrong button. Okay, so I'll just explain. But basically it was a chatbot demo. We're quite interested in understanding how this technology can be used in the genuine language environment. So one of the cases that we deal with in South Africa, but is also quite common in places where we have different cultural diversity, is that we're having to deal with language models that are able to speak more than one language in the same sentence. So that demo, that video demo, was an illustration of a chatbot that was able to code switch. So if you spoke to it in English, it would respond to you in English. If you spoke to it in isiZulu, it would respond to you in isiZulu without you having to say, I don't speak English, please speak isiZulu, for example. And those are the kinds of capabilities that we're looking to enable so that people can engage with technology more naturally, so that they can focus on the problem at hand and not focus on policing themselves in order for the technology to serve them. Cool. This is a response that we get quite often, though. It's like, is your business and the models and the research you do really relevant? Why don't you just use an LLM? So this little piece of the presentation is dedicated to why not LLMs. I literally had a conversation with a very successful product manager from a very highly ranked company last week. Tell me, what are you guys doing? You should just build LLMs. Yeah, it was a very interesting conversation. He's a Silicon Valley type, you know, part of that bubble. But this is why not LLMs. This is the previous version of ChatGPT 3. If you speak isiZulu, you've probably had a little chuckle. If you don't speak isiZulu, you can probably still understand it if you can understand me. In that counting from 1 to 10 in isiZulu is not, you can't just add the prefix gu to the English word to then do the counting. So here it says gu 1, gu 2, gu 3, gu 4, gu 5, gu 6. That is not how you count in isiZulu. They have since fixed this in ChatGPT 4. We think it might be because we wrote a blog post and complained about it. But this is one of the reasons that these language models do not work for the languages that we speak and interact with on a daily basis. You've probably tried this with your own languages. Some of them work better than others, but predominantly it doesn't work. And part of the reason why it doesn't work is because of these major challenges of building this technology. So the fundamental assumption around building AI technology is that you have an abundance of data, you have an abundance of information or examples to teach a machine your reality of the world. The other assumption is that you have the compute power. You have these really clever computers that are super powerful that are then able to crunch through that information at a speed that means that they're able to absorb it and make the relationships that need to be formed in order to pretend that they're able to do the task. And the third challenge is around funding. So on the African continent, even though we are abundant in natural, very valuable minerals and resources, money is not necessarily free-flowing here for the technology space and not necessarily from the outside world investing into the technology that we have here. So the first of those major challenges that according to Wikipedia, 0% of the internet is in African languages. This is taken from a Wikipedia page that highlights the 38 top languages that the internet is consisted of. About 51% of that is English. The last number on the list is 0.1%, and if you add up those 38 countries, it equals 100%. There are over 7,000 languages in the world, over 2,000 languages on the African continent. And yet, I mean, I think part of this is due to there not being a presence of our languages on the internet, but another part is that, you know, the indexing of how to be able to find a web page, if it is written in another language, is predominantly based off of Roman or Latin-based languages. So even the search functionality wouldn't necessarily be able to find them. But what this means is that we don't have that abundance data. We don't have that number one assumption about building successful AI models. Number two assumption, only one of the commercial data centers on the continent has GPUs. Now, maybe if you do some complex mathematical modeling yourself, you know that if you have access to a GPU, your mathematical modeling goes a lot faster, a lot quicker. But if we want to use GPU capability, we have to use GPUs that are based elsewhere, in the US, in Asia, somewhere else. There are moves to try and improve the amount of compute available to Africans by Liquid Telecom, I think. But we're still quite far behind in terms of having access to that very powerful compute that can build powerful models. I mean, it just means that we have to make smaller models that fit on a CPU. But then also on top of that, only 2.2% of African startups are funded by VCs and also work in the field of AI and IoT. And that's AI and IoT. I'm not sure what the percentage breakdown between that is, but it just means that, you know, what is the number that OpenAI is looking for? 7 trillion. $7 trillion. This is like, what, maybe a couple of 100 million maximum that we're having to serve the whole of the African continent. Some other challenges that we face within developing technology and language technology for the African continent is that people do believe that ChatGPT, Google, Amazon, Azure, and others are the answer. Rather than us taking agency in developing these things ourselves, and even industry players that we go to and we say, oh, we have the thing, you can use the thing. And they're like, we'll just use Google instead. In terms of market sizing and infrastructure, so because there is so much cultural diversity, often we get given the answer that how are you going to serve 2,000 languages, that doesn't necessarily make sense because the market is so fragmented, or the number of people that speaks a particular language, because it doesn't seem economically viable, it can be difficult to motivate for catering to all of them. Here we talk about the missing middle. This isn't just in terms of a missing middle class on the African continent. As time goes on, we have this disparity between people who have a lot of money and people who have virtually nothing, which means that you don't have the stable base in the middle who's able to invest in this technology, build the technology, use the technology. This is also in terms of the missing middle in business. We have a lot of small solo enterprise type business, and then we have the huge conglomerate corporates, and there's very few in the middle who are able to play and to experiment of new ways of doing things in a way that doesn't undermine their potential to succeed and isn't a huge corporate infrastructure that takes 5 years to move. Regulatory frameworks, and I'm not going to try and make eye contact with government members in the room. But a lot of the regulation around AI or even around building business with technology is very constrictive. It is very difficult to build a technology company on the African continent unless it is fintech. And we have a lot of challenges there. We have a lot of ethical challenges. I mentioned earlier about, the economics of language, deciding who should be remembered, who should be recorded and preserved versus who should not. Who does the data belong to? Who does the technology belong to? How do you distribute the wealth generated that is essentially being built off of people's culture and heritage? There are a lot of ethical questions that we as a company are having to grapple with, because we don't just want to do the green grass thing, We want to make sure that the technology we build is in line with our principles and our values and who we are as Africans. Infrastructure challenges, I mentioned the the one data center on the African continent having GPUs. But I mean, last week, Johannesburg is supposed to be one of the most successful cities on the African continent. And there was a day where we didn't have water, we didn't have electricity, and we didn't have data connection. How do you build an AI company if you don't have water, electricity, or a data connection? It's impossible, but we're doing it. Then we're also facing this challenge of open source data. I think there's been this incredible progress of open source technology being available to the world, which means many people can contribute to it. It means that it can develop a lot faster than if it was just a small bunch of people focusing on it. But there is a huge discussion around open source for who. So for example, if we do a data collection project that is able to generate data for the entire African continent, but we make that data fully available to your Facebooks and your Google and your Amazon and your Azures, what does that mean for the local players on the ground who only have access to one data center with GPUs? How do you then balance the logistics, the ethics, and the economics of having a sustainable AI ecosystem on the African continent when we're having to compete with these outside conglomerates? I mean, at the moment, we have this competitive edge because we can be smarter about how we build our models, and we have contextual knowledge, so we can deal with the limited amounts of data. But as soon as that data becomes available and we're able to then play into the standard infrastructures that are used to build everything else, how do we keep going? And then the last one, a question of funding. We as a startup have been very, very, very lucky that we've received funding, which means we're able to pay the staff, we're able to keep that talent on the African continent, we're able to get compute and create data sets. But that is a special story. That isn't the same story for the thousands of people who are wanting to create natural language processing startups. These are some other challenges. Some of them are the same because I didn't delete the slide. But yeah, you've been sitting for a while. I know Ulrich said you wouldn't be sitting for 2 hours, but I think you're maybe probably at like 2 now. So just to get a little bit of engagement in the room, I would like to ask a question. So ChatGPT 3, this is the one before the latest one, is estimated to require 120,000 kilowatt hours to train once. How many Johannesburg homes could this power for a month? Could I have hands up for an A, 5 Johannesburg homes? Nobody thinks so. 100 Johannesburg homes. Few people. 12,000 Johannesburg homes. Yeah, you're correct. It is 12,000. Oh, whoops, it says 1,000. Oh, yeah. It's supposed to be 12,000, I missed a zero. But yeah, so when you're looking at the infrastructure challenges of just being able to train this capability just once, you're making the decision between having 12,000 homes powered for a month versus having this fancy technology. And so for us, really, why not LLMs is an obvious answer. But there are some extra advantages too around smaller models. So for us, smaller models means a lower barrier to entry. And this means that low barrier to entry is independent of resource constraints. So this means more people can contribute to building the technology because they're not inhibited by the data or the compute. And it means that more people can use the technology because you don't need this huge infrastructure in order to service it. For us, it means lower cost because you need less data and you need less compute. It means that there's just a lower cost to serving and hosting these machine learning models. And that means it's just more accessible. So you're able to bridge the digital divide without having to depend on these huge centralized resources. Instead, we're able to work in a distributed way. That means more people can have access and direct impact now in the present. And yeah, sure, it would be nice to do LLMs. Then we do have a fundamental research team who's working on that, hence the camel corn. But we cannot wait for the data and the compute and funding for us to start enacting change. Another question. I hope I got the zeros right on this one. I think I did, because it comes from a previous presentation. So how much power do you think a human brain uses? Is it A, 20 watts? Raise your hand. Cool. Is it B, 500 watts? Cool. Is it C, 500 kilowatts? I can tell what kind of audience this is because you got the answers right. Yeah, so the amount of power that a brain uses is 20 watts. And this is kind of crazy. A light bulb, I think, a standard one, uses 60 watts. So the amount of compute that a brain is able to do in just a couple of seconds does not require a lot of energy at all. And yet, one of the most impressive technologies of all time costs 12,000 Johannesburg homes for the month to run. And this brings us on to some further investigations as to why not LLMs. And this is in opposition principally to the extractivism that happens in the world at large, but specifically for the African continent. So having smaller models is more equitable, so bridging the digital and economic divide as described earlier. But this idea of less is more. So there's not enough in the world for equitable overconsumption. So if we all learn to create smaller models that are able to do more with less, it means that we just have more models and that more people are able to have more, rather than a few benefiting. I really like that thing you said earlier around technology. Well, you said science is not meant to make a few people rich. Neither is technology. Technology is supposed to make the world a better place for more people. That's why we build it. And what this means is that you know, if we fully rely on just text data and voice data as a representative of our language, text and voice is a very lossy compression of that information transfer. And what this opens up to is a whole range of questions of how we can reimagine what language technology might look like. And what an LLM might look like, even. And it brings about questions that we're interested in exploring alongside our, you know, camel vision. This is a bit more of the unicorn stuff, but what does language technology look like when constraint is the canvas? When we consider different representations of language, we know as humans, yes, we consume about 20 megabytes per second of video and audio information, but what else are we consuming, and therefore what else could our models learn from? I mean, at the moment they just learn from text and voice. There isn't actually, it's a very narrow bandwidth in terms of information of being able to absorb from the real world. I knew that would happen. I was editing that first line in the seat now and it didn't update. And what it was really supposed to say is like, what does language technology look like when it's also learning from interacting with the physical world? When it's not just a textual or a voice one? How do you, I mean, it sounds a bit strange. How do you embed pheromones into a language model so that it can tell when people are scared or afraid or happy or excited without having to use verbal or written language? What does language technology look like for languages that are not literal? This is a huge problem on the African continent. A huge problem for studying isiZulu, for example, where often people complain about translations being way too literal and therefore not making sense. When you speak in idiomatic phrases and when you speak in circles in order to communicate a concept, it's not necessarily the actual words, it's whatever thought is in the mind that you're trying to communicate that is actual language. So what does a language model look like when it's not speaking literally? Can we get to that place? What does language technology look like for a place of oral tradition? Can we bypass text? So this is another thing that is very prevalent on the African continent and tied in very tightly with our issues of literacy, not just digital literacy, but literacy as a barrier to entry for information. Can we just do voice-to-voice technology so that we don't have to pretend people are only smart if they can read and write? Can we leapfrog this opportunity for people to have access to information, even if it is a bit slower because it's voice? But can we just do voice-to-voice rather than having to go through text in order to provide functionality? What happens when you build with people instead of for them? So we know that a lot of the technology that we import from the West isn't very relevant to the context. What happens when you're building alongside the people you're building for? What is the opportunity for that technology to be more relevant if you're just not giving it to them? What is language? When a language is not authentically represented by the alphabet it is written in. My whole life, my name has been butchered. And it's because it's written in a Roman alphabet and it's not a Roman language. And this is prevalent for a lot of languages. I think Yoruba is one of the only that has annotations that tell you how the language is actually pronounced and how it is communicated. And everybody else has been stuck with the Roman one that doesn't describe the way that we express ourselves. And then you're trying to teach it to a machine. It doesn't quite make sense. What does language technology when it adapts to regional changes and colloquialisms? And how can we make that adaptive domain change something that happens quite quickly and quite easily so that, you know, going back to rugby analogies, but in the World Cup last year, South Africa got in a lot of trouble because of a phrase in Afrikaans saying "die wit kant," and somebody on the UK team thought he had been sworn at. So how is it that we don't have language models that are able to understand that cultural difference and cultural context, so we can avoid things like that, not just between humans, but in the language domain? So I think you're probably starting to put together the picture of why it is so important to have these language models built on the African continent for African people. But I'm just going to try drive that home a little bit more with the why behind Lelapa AI. So the first why is around local solutions. These symbols are taken from Credo Mutwa's book, which has now escaped me, the main one. But they are Bantu symbols that represent concepts in our languages. And the first one is around wisdom. And so local solutions refers to the wisdom to know that we do not have to consume technology that was not made for us, and that we can have the agency to create our own. We refer to the local context, so being able to solve problems alongside our African family, focusing on impact and economic change, and allowing for that technology to benefit the world. You know, if we're able to teach them how to do more with less, that is something that everyone can benefit from. And on the third side, and this was touched on briefly earlier as well, it's part of why it's a big reason as to why we started this thing is around local talent. We wanted to be a home for African talent to invest their time and energy in building up where they came from, rather than exporting all of their talent, expertise, and effort into building places that don't represent the communities that they come from. And for us, that is exceptionally important, that we're able to bring Africans back to the continent to do their best work here. And at the end of the day, we are a technology company, but we are a socially grounded one. And this is the camel part of us really wanting to enact change on the ground. When we first started, we thought we were going to be an incubator because we wanted to be able to scale the potential of AI helping to leapfrog through developmental challenges. But what we realized is that you can't do any of those things. You cannot provide technology services and products if you don't solve the language problem first. Language, you know, the internet is fantastic. It's great. But what use is the internet and all the energy and effort put into it if somebody cannot understand what is written there? And that is the same for products and services. What good use is a banking app if the mass market that you're aiming for cannot understand what the banking app does because it does not understand the language? And when we look at the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, language is a core component of 17 of them, about those things being able to be possible because you're able to communicate and connect freely. But then again, this balance of the camel and the unicorn, we do also want to increase the quality of life in the everyday. And I gave the analogy earlier of my name being butchered my whole life. Maybe if we had better language technology, then people would be able to pronounce it. But I wanted to ask here, how many of you speak English at home? How many of you speak other languages at home? There you go. So in South Africa, only 8% of people speak English as a home language, as released by some results a couple of months ago. And for the African continent, I mean, you may have in the Francophone speaking areas French or I think Spanish in one or two and Portuguese in others. But what this means is that people are having to engage in the languages that are not their mother or father tongues. And how many of you who don't speak English at home, when you were a child, or even now, when your parents shouted at you, what language did they speak? Did they speak English? And yet, when we and our mothers and our fathers and our aunts and our uncles need to call into a company to complain to them, what language do they speak? They speak English. And part of this is because the technology that monitors the quality of the call needs to be able to convert that voice into text. And it can't convert that voice into text if the language is not English, and therefore You have a bunch of people being forced to express their deepest, darkest desires to somebody who has wronged them in a foreign language. How many of you use WhatsApp? How many of you use WhatsApp in a language that isn't English or French or Spanish? How often do you have to back? Because autocorrect is just telling you that what you're saying doesn't exist. How many of you have non-English names? And every time you type your name into a Word document, it puts a red squiggly line underneath to be like, actually, you don't exist. You're wrong. Yeah, so these are the very real everyday experiences of people on the African continent, and they seem trivial. But the amount of times where you're told that who you are, where you come from, and what you value is not an accepted norm, and you have to forget all of that in order to assimilate to a future, a digital future, is quite a heartbreaking one. And I'll just take you through a couple of examples of how that can then be, inhibited from scaling to solve really real-world exciting problems, of like having a person in a rural area who could have access to a mobile phone that could help them make a booking appointment with a nearby clinic. And that nearby clinic could then tell them how severe their symptoms are and when they actually need to go in. And they can be sure that when they spend their last bit of money on the 3 taxis in order to get to that clinic, that when they get there, they can be helped and the clinic knows what they need to be helped with. It could be the difference between a farmer in a rural area receiving information on his mobile phone saying that a locust plague is coming and these are the types of things that he needs to do in order to save his crop. It could be saying that a huge weather event is coming and these are the types of things you need to do in order to mitigate the risks associated with that. I mean, in this case, it could be the difference between a child having to learn English or French or Portuguese first before they learn maths and science. Therefore, prolonging the learning phase of those kids rather than them just being able to dive straight in from day one with a language that they already know. And so, yeah, when we think about what the future might look like, I think, we've been given a number of examples from television with, Wakanda and Black Panther. But it still seems so far away from the reality of the now. And that is that we can be part of generating that future, and we don't need to deprive ourselves of that future. It doesn't have to be decided by somebody else. We can determine what's important for us. We can determine what we want for our communities, and we can build it. Even if we don't have electricity, water, and a data connection. Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, that is a good point. I was going to say one more thing around how Africa needs to be at the forefront of the AI revolution. I saw a lot of you looking at that screen and thinking about it quite deeply, so I'm just going to share some thoughts here. There are a number of reasons why this needs to be. As mentioned earlier, we have a very youthful population, and the projections are that by 2050, a quarter of the world's population is going to be African. And that's going to be African youth. It means it's going to be a quarter of the world who is African youth, then having to sustain aging populations all over the rest of the world. And if we don't want to just be carers for the aged foreign nationals, we need to have different solutions so that we can choose to have a different life. But in addition to that, all of these natural resources and minerals being used to build these fancy AI technologies, cobalt, coltan, copper, lithium for batteries, all of that is extracted from African soils. And we know very well what kind of social instability has been driven in the attempt to get those resources at a cheaper cost. And if we want our history to be different, our future history. If we want our futures to be different to our histories, it means that we need to be able to take the reins and decide how those resources will be extracted in order to enable that digital future. So there's multiple reasons, you know, for the youth of tomorrow, for the resources in the ground, and to make sure that we're actually genuinely solving the communities that we come from and that we care about. Yeah, thank you so much.